Hello, everyone. So we have another great panel. So it's pronounced Lara. Is that correct?
Yes, thank you for asking, Lara.
Absolutely. So you are a doctor and an activist. So this is a very good perspective to have. We have Edwin DeJesus, who was our lead organizer in New York, March for Medicare for All. And we have Ed, who is on our organizing team for this weekend. So thank you all so much for joining us here. And what an important discussion. And there's a reason why we put this at the end, because everything we've learned for the past 3 days, how are we going to implement it into action? Some people say vote harder. Some people say direct action. Some people say both. So we're going to have the discussion of what is the most beneficial as far as our takes and what we can do to try to reach our goals. So I'm going to go around. What do you think? Well, let's put it this way. In other countries, we see people in the streets by the thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands. And what do you think is the biggest obstacle in why in America we're still asking and not demanding?
Well, I would say number one, we lack a coherent leadership. So there's like this huge political disconnect. So the mass of people in general are sympathetic to what we're for. And the question comes up, well, how could there be so many people that are sympathetic to this, but they're not really in motion? How can we get people in motion? And then you can look at, well, who are the titular heads of the movement and what the role does the media play, the ruling class and all the other organizations that tamp down activism, that confuse people, disorient them, make them feel they're ineffectual or powerless. And that's what we face. We face the system, and we don't really have what we're trying to do, I would say, is get an organized expression that represents our interests, that can move in coalition with other like-minded people. We don't have that yet because we have a neutered labor movement. That normally in most countries, you have a class labor movement that's fighting for big things. In this country, which what I like to talk about when we get on, is that's one of our weaknesses. We have a labor movement that's been destroyed by McCarthyism, so they don't even know how to fight. So anyway, that's kind of like my beginning take.
Right. And if we go around, so Edwin, we'll just go around that way. Well, it might be opposite from the way you guys are seeing it, but yeah.
Yeah, so I think wealth and income inequality is one of the biggest reasons we have so much infighting, not just as activists, but as neighbors. And the difficult thing about that is the more infighting we have, the more wealth and income inequality we allow to continue happening. So it's a vicious cycle that as the American empire continues to decline, we the people begin to fight and become more angry and hateful at each other than at the ruling class or the oligarchs or the top 1% or whatever you want to call it. So until we can actually gain some sort of monetary and financial power as ordinary people, we're more than likely going to keep allowing ourselves to succumb to these same tropes where it's either the fault of immigrants or the fault of the Republicans or whatever it is. But when in reality, it's the military industrial complex, the large corporations, Wall Street, the big fossil fuel industry, big pharma, private health insurance companies. These are the actual sources of the suffering. It's a little bit harder to articulate and visualize that these entities are the sources of suffering because nobody on CNN, MSNBC, or Fox is going to tell you outright that these are your enemy. They're going to tell you that your neighbor is your enemy.
Thanks, Edwin. And I think, to name the elephant in the room is racial capitalism is a huge part of this, right? So I think part of what racial capitalism does is also make certain things legible to us and others not. So we do have a labor movement happening. It might be disjointed in many different ways, and I'm not sure that that has to be a failure, right? We see, especially during the pandemic, how many folks, both locally and then on a national level, are working together to sort of fortify their communities and make sure that their communities are taken care of. The slogan, right? We take care of us. And I think that needs to be a legitimate movement that we see and hear and platform and make coalitions with across the board. And I think that's part of it. Part of it is sort of being rewired to think about labor movements in a particular way rather than seeing all the organizing that are happening. I mean, we saw with Amazon, right? If we were to just say, no, this is not, and because quote unquote, it failed. I think that language of failure is something that consistently brings us down rather than seeing how do we support people to seize those moments when they have them, and then how do we continue to move forward rather than sort of recapitulate these racial lines that the United States particularly is imbricated in. These are fault lines that go way back, but they're also myths, right? There's labor organizing across racial lines that go way far back, and I think that, but we have to name racism, sexism, and labor movement, so on and so forth, that structure some of this, and I think that's a starting point for us. Oh, you're muted.
No.
I can't hear you.
Can't hear
No,
you.
you're muted.
Okay, that's only the 20th time I've done that this weekend, in fairness. So I was saying, Ed, you brought up a point, and I'm not sure if you meant this literally, but you said the word leader. And I want to discuss that. Do we need a leader? Many of us were burners. Many of us. I mean, I moved to Iowa to volunteer for 5 weeks. I have a Bernie tattoo. Like, a lot of us got our start with Bernie. But not me, us. Do we need a leader? We see so many people making posts like, who should be our next leader? Should it be AOC? Should it be Pramila Jayapal? Who gives a shit? So I want to just kind of go around and see what your takes are. Do we need that one person who's going to just be our savior?
Well, of course we don't need one leader, but the reality is we need, for a movement to move forward, we need a vision, and we need to have a collective understanding of what it's going to take us to get there, which is totally different than relying on a individual leader to guide us. What we're talking about, or what I'm talking about, is not deciding, but creating the conditions that workers, average citizens, will be able to see their power and embrace their power and understand what it means to make a change. And when they do that, they can become the leader. So when, like I spent my life organizing unions, you can't tell people that, well, let's organize a union so we can get better wages, hours, and conditions of employment, improve our lives and our community. But nobody is going to lead the people. We need an organizing committee. And that's the fundamental thing that we lack on the ground, number one. And we also lack a national poll that pulls together all of the individuals around the country that can push us forward. If you look at anything in the country that has ever happened positively on a mass scale, it's been a mass movement. Now, there were leaders in that movement, but it was basically common, ordinary people that pushed the agenda. And so however you want to phrase that, but you got to dismiss the idea of individual leaders. And I'm sorry that you got hoodwinked by Bernie Sanders, because he allegedly was a revolutionary, but he turned his movement off. No movement can be turned off by people who are conscious. You can't turn off a revolutionary movement because one person says so. So, well, let's just disabuse ourselves of that and kind of work together. That's really that's really what everybody fears who has the power. They fear everyday people getting active.
I will say to that, my many issues with Bernard, but I will say that I will always, always, always be grateful to that man for waking me up, for giving me a free education, for making me an activist, for inspiring me to do a show, for teaching me what Medicare for All is, teaching me, like, that man changed many lives. And he also made things like Medicare for All a household talking term. So I respect my roots. No matter how bad he pisses me off, I respect my roots, and I will always love him for that.
Well, could I just say one more thing? Is whenever I was in my early 20s, I got my first job. I was working in the steel mill, and I got a job working for 1199, the Hospital Workers Union. It was and I went to my grandfather, who was a steel worker, and I said, you know what? I got a job working with the union. And he looked at me and he said, you mean the CIO? And I said, no, a union. And he couldn't figure it out. That's my whole point. You talk about learning something. You learn from the fact that when they organized a union in the 30s, they organized a movement. They were part of an upheaval of society, and not some bureaucratic organization that went out and organized 10 workers and then they hired a lawyer to do something. It was a bigger issue. So when you say Sanders did all those things, but I have to say that opened my eyes up. You know, I thought I was really cool. 22 years old, I thought I knew everything, you know, and I thought, how the hell does this guy tell me what a real union is? And it kind of wakes you up. So that's my story.
Edwin?
Yeah, I have a similar sentiment about Bernie as you do. I was national advance on his 2020 presidential campaign, and I was also heartbroken in the final days when he was calling Joe Biden his friend, kind of refused to really attack him at his weakest points, and ultimately didn't give the closure to the millions of people that were supporting him that we so desperately wanted. And I think that all the people that came out in droves by the tens of thousands to his rallies, those are the real leaders. Those are the people who came together under the common purpose of Bernie's movement. But at the end of the day, it is really us and the next generation of activists who are going to carry that torch and hopefully take his ideas and try to isolate them from the two-party duopoly and try to do what the OG Bernie did, which is run as an independent, do these sorts of street actions, and not always pretend that the lesser of two evils narrative is something that we need to be putting our focus onto. So do we need a centralized leader? No, I think we need decentralized entities of authority where we can come together and not actually have to rely on a figure or a set of figures that can easily become corrupted. Chris Smalls is a great example of a labor leader with the Amazon Labor Union, and we've worked together. And what he's doing is crucial in getting the Staten Island warehouse workers some sense of justice, because not only have they been abused by Amazon, they've also been abused by law enforcement as well. So the more that we can support more grassroots efforts like the ones that Chris Smalls is doing and other efforts on the ground, I think that's how we're actually going to build the power so that we have different leaders in different regions, but no one person, if they were to either drop from the face of the earth, that would have any impact on the rest of the movement, that it can be self-sustainable regardless of a particular person or entity or group or political party.
Absolutely. Lara?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. My political alignment is very much to decentralize power and not have a sort of cult of personality. I think where we really need to put, ourselves and where rubber hits the road is saying, if that's the case, then we also have to make space for more radical parts of this movement. And I think that's often what we end up seeing, is that these movements cannibalize themselves and end up sort of moving more center anyway. So if we're saying we want to decentralize, I think it's incumbent upon us, the movements, the sort of local movements, the grassroots effort, to say all strategies have to be on the table, right? And because we understand how structures work, right? Because we understand that a structure, if we're needing people inside and we're needing people on the street and we're needing people in all these spaces to organize, and if we know that systems themselves end up slowly sort of making their way to center, then we also have to be okay with all strategies that have a really large understanding of what a leftist movement looks like, which includes radical left. This is something that we might look at to different countries outside of the United States. It isn't looking at Bernie as the most left side of things, right? I think, again, what ends up happening is a sort of seduction or invitation in for radical leftists, anarchists, communists, to then become Bernie supporters or become sort of party line holders. We need everybody on board to start to do this. And I think that's the piece that I would like to invite us all to think about. How do we make a massive movement? And that means that we can't have people sidelined.
Absolutely. And that actually brings us to our next question. So I want to reverse and start with you, Lara. We're on Twitter. Edwin, you're on Twitter. Ed, I don't know if you're on Twitter, but let's say Twitter can be a very good animal for organizing, promoting things, and then it could be straight up the devil. So what I want to discuss is, we have seen so much toxicity, as in, let's organize, but not that way. Not that way. I was the disabled spokesperson for Force the Vote. I shared my story for the very first time about going blind, and it had over 130,000 views. And the next day, Jimmy Dore trended. This is what we're seeing. We did 56 actions in one day, Medicare for all, in July. What happened? People in Florida, I'm not taking part in this because I don't like the one person who's speaking for 5 minutes in California. This is the problem. There's so much divisiveness. I just want to go around. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, I think, part of it for me, I'm going to put my clinical hat on as a clinical psychologist and say, what is the structure that's underlying this, and what are the issues that people are speaking to that end up materializing in these ways, right? And I'm not sure that we're really speaking to these issues. Racism in this movement is real. Sexism in this movement is real. Ableism in this movement is real. Transphobia in this movement is real, right? And I think we really get into problems when we start to disconnect labor movements from these other liberation struggles. And so sometimes I think listening to the symptom, if we're seeing these things happen over and over again, what is the symptom that we need to be really looking at and attending to internally as we continue to move forward with building networks and coalitions? For us to just stop and say, this is just divisiveness, let's put it, and I don't think that's what you're saying, but I hear that sometimes, right? Oh, this is divisive. If we just stopped fighting, we would make something work. But I think there's something to be said in what people are raising flags about. And we really do ourselves a disservice when we're not looking at these things that replicate themselves in our movement, just like in the oppressive structures we're trying to push up against.
Absolutely. Ed?
Oh, okay. I think as far as our role is to take people where their consciousness is at the moment and try to move them, what I would say, up their class consciousness, their racial consciousness, their consciousness that they're workers, that everybody is in this together, and use wherever they're at and take that and try to make conscious arguments to move them forward or uplift them, take them away from their backwardness. And that's just the reality. Unfortunately, that's just life. We have to be able to understand what we're for, what we're trying to promote, what are our arguments, what are the negatives that people, and be the best spokespeople for that. And I think that there's always going to be that. I mean, we had the Medicare for All rally in Pittsburgh, and it was exactly the same thing. We had a group of people that literally would come to the meeting and they say, well, there's somebody in Fort Wayne, Indiana. We don't really like them. So therefore, you should cancel the rally in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, because there's some person in Fort Wayne that we think is really bad. And I said, well, what the hell are you talking about? This is like ridiculous. We're going to move ahead. You're always going to find an issue, something like that. So I think we have to just work at it and try to remember. And I, again, from my experience, and I'll go back again, I'll just say, you all talk about Bernie Sanders. Well, I was Jesse Jackson. Now, you guys might think he's an old timer. He is. I was Jesse Jackson's labor coordinator in Pennsylvania in 1988. And he was trying to build, he had the Rainbow Coalition. And then a la Bernie Sanders, right after his run in 1988, he dropped the Rainbow Coalition. And we thought, holy cow, this was a good vehicle to keep moving. It was a mass-based class, women, gays, everything in there together. And then later, I also was Dennis Kucinich's Pennsylvania coordinator. He talked about Medicare for all way before Bernie Sanders did. So all we're saying is that the history is very important to understand. And I think if you look at the history of how things have evolved and how we've gotten to where we're at today, you can learn a lot and maybe learn how to deal with the ins and outs of people's attitudes and changes in what they think is important, because it'll also give you a steady path to follow.
Edwin?
Yeah, one thing I always like to share about the March for Medicare for All in New York City in particular was that we didn't just have progressives or leftists come out to this event. We had people who are very libertarian, Republican, even conservative people who came out and volunteered to put this event together. And for some people, they couldn't wrap their minds around that, because unless they're kind of within that same ideological bubble, they would view that person as their enemy. And I think that's one of the hardest things to get across to people, is that's the biggest deception, is that because somebody is on the other end of the political aisle than you, that they are very different from you. When in fact, if you're a member of the working class, you likely have 99% of things in common with someone. And that 1% of things that you disagree with is what always gets blown out and exaggerated in the media and on social media platforms. And I will highly recommend this documentary that I watched about Twitter and its algorithms. It's called The Social Dilemma, and it goes in depth about how what really gets engagement on social media platforms are things that provoke anger, are buzzwords that get people riled up with their emotions. And these algorithms, they stay there, they're ingrained in your account. If you post something today versus if you post something months ago with certain keywords, you'll likely get the same audience, and you'll have the same people liking that tweet and the same people trying to ratio and comment hateful things on that tweet, because that's what generates engagement. And the more engagement that a platform like Twitter gets, eventually the more monetary value that they get out of that through ads. So I think it's important that when we do communicate on these online platforms, it might be more convenient to have a snarky one-liner that generates a lot of retweets. But when you actually try to be less vague and go more into detail about specifics, okay, yes, that's not going to circulate as much through the algorithm, but that's how you can actually maybe connect to one or two people who disagree with you on a deeper level. And I think that if you can level with others and show some compassion and show some humility, and nobody likes to be told that they're wrong, and nobody will ever really want to admit that they're wrong, even if there's data or evidence right in front of them. I think the best thing that you can do is tell people where they are correct, and where that you think that there could be further dialogue. And really, Twitter's just not the best platform for that kind of dialogue. It's really more of an arena for fighting, like a coliseum. It's really not the place to come together and build coalitions. I think a better place for people to come together, and I might be getting a little ahead of myself here, would be through something like a decentralized autonomous organization or a DAO, where people can have equal amounts of say and transparency in their decision making within activism and organizing. through something like a blockchain or a public ledger, where everyone has some sort of equal input into the group's strategy. And that way you won't get this sort of infighting and purity tests that ultimately destroy movements from the inside.
And
One,
I'm sorry.
Yeah, can I just say, I mean, in theory, I agree about coalition building, but I want to just push up a little bit about this, because I think that there's ways in which we can also be very cavalier about asking people to fundamentally compromise who they are in their identity and the very real material effects of these things when we're saying you should be able to come and march in the street with Republicans or conservatives. I'm not saying that that's not, you know, that some people don't do that, but I think there's a way in which we mobilize shame to have people sort of join in these efforts. And that is psychically is not going to work, because fundamentally that 1% of their thing that they disagree on, for that one person might actually be a dividing line between true safety and not. And so I think we need to push ourselves on this and not sort of mobilize. The reason why people don't show up with Republicans or conservatives is not because they don't understand themselves as workers. It's because there's very real material impact, and we have seen who this falls on over and over and over and over again, and who is tasked with organizing the actual material effects of these positions that are taken as though, oh, this is just an opinion or ideology, when what we're seeing, particularly in the context of the United States, is these things actually translate into real issues. We're seeing it in Texas, in Florida, and Alabama, when we're talking about trans health rights for kids, for example. This is not a small thing. This might be one sliver of somebody's identity, but that one sliver is a central piece that might allow them to have actual care or actual dignity in life versus not, right? And so I think we have to be, I'm not sure that that's the right answer. Actually, I'm not going to say I'm not sure. I'm sure that's not the right answer, to mobilize shame and say, just dialogue a little further, because there are some things that can't be dialogued about, because fundamentally ask people to compromise their being to even insert themselves into that dialogue.
Well, look, could I just say, I think there's tens of millions of people that we have to reach. And our goal here should be talking about how are we going to reach these tens of millions of people who need Medicare for all, who need national health care, and who are basically victims of the system. And it's like, that's our role. How are we going to organize them into a broad popular movement? To me, that's really what we should be talking about, right? Isn't that what we're supposed to be doing? How do we move people into our orbit, so to speak, because we think that we need a movement? So how are we going to reach them? And what's our message to reach them? And because there's tens of millions that we don't have the capability of reaching. If all the public opinion polls are true, that's what we have to focus on. And we shouldn't be worried about, fighting among each other, because there's a lot of people who are ready to gravitate to this message. Then I think organizationally, to me, that's really the focus for if we're going to organize in the future.
Edwin?
I will say one of the most profound images I've seen in recent years was, excuse my dog barking in the background, was an image of a Trump supporter and a BLM protester, two groups coming together hand in hand. And they were actually both protesting against certain mandates and restrictions that the government was levying on them. And to me, I found this to be quite revolutionary in a time where there is so much division, that people were able to come together in this sort of way and have some sort of mutual respect for each other. And this kind of act of love, I think personally, is revolutionary. And I completely agree with what you are saying, that there is some sort of limit to where it could become actual threats of violence. And I agree wholeheartedly with that. I guess for me, the only pushback would be, if you're going to look at it through the paradigm of, Democrat and Republican, I would say that they're both anti-choice to a degree, because Democrats could have fought to codify Roe v. Wade, for example, but they didn't. And I think that they kind of egg each other on. And when it comes to these certain issues, like to kind of point the finger at the respective boogeyman. But at the end of the day, it's really the politicians of these parties who are the ones that kind of create these laws. And I think that when it comes to the grassroots organizers, whether they are Democrat or Republican, you tend to see much more of an anti-establishment alignment that really doesn't it doesn't go far in our current society, because it's usually shame to see, hey, why are you guys coming together on this issue of, like for the mandates, for example. I think the trucker protest in particular is what a working class movement looks like. It's not pretty. There's going to be infiltrators. There's going to be people within that movement who have hateful ideologies. But overall, just people coming together and, blocking supply chain lines as a matter of protest, and having a stand when it comes to multiple demands in terms of labor rights. It was kind of saddening to see so many people on the left kind of talk negatively about it, because I thought, well, if we're ever going to have a general strike, I mean, this is it. I mean, this is what it would look like. And to call it fascism, I think it's the antithesis of fascism. I think the government, the Trudeau regime, the Biden administration, that is more aligned with actual fascism. And I'll end on this note. I think when it comes to, and this kind of goes back to the leadership topic we were talking about earlier, I don't think it's really I don't really think it's worth debating, Trump versus Biden or Biden versus Obama or whatever it is. I think at the end of the day, you have to look at how do people react to these people when they get elected into power. Because when Trump was in power, we had all these groups, moderates, leftists, even Republicans, coming together on a common goal of wanting to put a check on Trump's power. And we saw a lot of grassroots movements and street actions occur under his administration that led to more change. And we saw a lot of activism and people getting radicalized. But now that Biden is in power, we're starting to see a much larger pacification of the masses and less activism and less direct action because of the fear of censorship and the fear of ostracization from society and isolation, and also punishment in the form of your social reputation or even your ability to function properly at a workplace without being discredited or put at a disadvantage.
I'm sorry. I can't not push up against you about the trucker movement. It is a fascist movement. You have one Nazi or one Confederate flag, and that's going to spoil the whole lot. And I'm sorry. There's no way I'm going to stand behind having swastikas, which were in the DC area, and anyone aligned with that movement. That's the hard line that we have to push. And that's what I mean about that. We need to be able to take these positions and not take the reactionary route. Any position, any anti-establishment movement with no material or political analysis and no underlining or underpinning movement towards justice and liberation for all is a reactionary movement. And that it's okay for us to say these things. That's part of why we need to have these conversations. And don't get me wrong, I'm never going to stand in line with Democrats or with Republicans. I would never do that. But I think these false binaries that we end up being, because we're against Trump and we're against Biden, then let's stand with the truckers. I'm not seeing any coherent argument about that. And again, when I see one swastika and one Confederate flag, I think it's okay for us to take that position. Now, is there consciousness raising, like Ed, you were saying? I respect old school labor organizing that I think we need more of. Absolutely. But I think there needs to be a massive redistribution of the responsibility who does that and who goes into those spaces, right?
Well, I'll tell you,
I'm not going to show up to a.
Okay. I would say, as far as, divisiveness, just sorry to interject, is that's like a straw man. I would look at it as a straw man. How could there be divisiveness in a society when what are we trying to organize? We're trying to organize a mass movement for healthcare. Millions don't have it. You look at every poll, majority people want Medicare for all. You look at all the polls, we'll forget about modern monetary theory, but the Wall Street Journal had a poll 2 or 3 years ago. People were screaming they wanted to tax the rich. There's everything that people wanted, even in Biden's weak, tepid agenda. It all had popular support. My point is that if we're going to move forward in this next period, we have to realize that all of the things that we want are there. We have to figure out the mechanisms to mobilize people to move a critical mass so that we can begin to change the power equation in the street and in the electoral arena. The people are there. We have to figure out how we're going to organize them and what's the method we're going to use to get them, because I think our issues remain. And that's where the Democrats and Republicans, they're interested in creating these cultural wars, fighting against each other, this and that, on issues that don't matter to most people. I'm sorry, but the reality is the class issue is the main issue, and that's what we have to focus on. People who don't have Medicare for all are mostly poor people. And if we got Medicare for all, that would be the biggest uplifting of justice, economic and racial justice in the society. Yet nobody talks about that. That's what we have to talk about. And our alleged leaders in the Medicare for all movement, whether it was the ones that tanked the forced to vote, and you have Jayapal. Jayapal says, well, we can't even have a vote on Medicare for all. It will destroy our movement. Yet she's the leader of the movement. She's supposedly the leader. And it's kind of like we have to come to grips with some of these things as so we can figure out what we can do as, I would say, the real organizers, the real people. And but it's like dismissing some of these other things. It's just, we're just going to get into a circular firing squad and we're going to kill ourselves. Yet there's millions of people that need what we're fighting for. And that's who we ought to focus on.
And I just want to say that the thing is, Lara was speaking about racial equality, and I don't want to conflate that with everything, because that is so important, and that is its own inequity within an inequity. And I think, let's look at something like the Women's March. Okay, it's a parade. It's not a march. It's a parade. It happens one day a year. It's most speakers are white, well-off women. And there is absolute racial disparities within movements. So many times people do things and they do not give people of color, they do not give LGBTQ people the mic, things like that. And that is such a huge component of what we need to do as white people when we are organizing. We need to make sure that people are represented, and we need to make sure that they have a voice and that those things are considered. Because while it may be easy for us to be like, yeah, but let's just work with everyone. Not that I'm saying you said that. That brings up a great point. There were swastikas. There were Confederate flags. Now, Edwin, I totally see what you're saying as far as it was a mass movement and it was working class. Absolutely. But Lara, you are right. Once you have something hateful in that, absolutely taints everything. So, I mean, Lara, if you'd like to continue, I don't want to speak for you, but
No, I appreciate that. I think just to speak to Ed is, I don't think we can unlink class from race, gender, ability, and sexuality. I think that's what gets us in trouble to begin with. So that if we're just saying, class is a central issue, which I happen to agree with you, class cuts across everything. Right. But then we're saying, and then we need, like, all these other things don't really matter to the average working person. We're imagining a particular type of average working person. And that's why we continue to only focus primarily, or movements overemphasize the white working class, when in this country, particularly in this settler colony, I will say, not just country, in this settler colony, indigenous brown and black women make up the primary working class that we have. And we can't keep this messaging of it's just class and then not focus on all these issues. This idea of delinking these issues is precisely what creates these problems to begin with. So then the white working class can't imagine a linking up with their siblings, with their black, brown,
I think we're saying the same thing, that the working class is all, it's multiracial, multinational working class. And I think if you read, I guess one of the best examples of this is the book called The Long Deep Grudge. It's about the agricultural and agricultural implement workers in Louisville, Kentucky, who literally would go out and help integrate the parks. And this was a working class. This is what they did. Their union did that. That's the kind of labor unions, labor movement we need. And it's no secret that they had the best contracts. They had the most integrated workforce. They did the right things because they had an ideology. They were fighters. And that's all we're saying is we have the capability of doing that now. That's necessary. People don't want to think about doing that. Why? Because they think they could get an easy road. All they have to do is elect some person, AOC. She's going to be our leader. She says she's really a tough gal, which is just absurd, because we need to build the kinds of labor unions and the kind of organizations that did exist in the past. They did exist. The idea that somehow this is all new is sometimes not really true. Yeah, and these unions fought. That's how the organization of many of these things had a historical example, and that we have to try to figure out what it was so we can move ourselves away from the current strategy, which is let's focus on who's elected in Congress, which foundation is going to give us money, how can we get access to certain people in Congress, because if we piss them off, they're really never going to be on, and they're really on your side. And it would be the best example is you have 100-some people in Congress that claim they're for Medicare for all, yet 50 of them get awards from the Medicare Advantage industry. And yet the current leaders of our alleged movement, they don't want to raise that. They say, oh, well, that's not acceptable. That's what we have to focus on and tell people, these are the people that you have to look at as leaders. Do you really think they're your leaders? Are you going to follow them into battle? And I think that once we start doing practical things like that, we'll be better able to win people over, because they'll see us as honest people. And we won't make mistakes. It's best to just be honest.
No, I agree with you, Ed. And I think this idea of that this is not new is really important for us, because that's just when we also go into this place of feeling hopeless, like we have to reinvent the wheel. I mean, Robin D.G. Kelley, of course, looks at, in his book, Hammer and Hoe, looks at Alabama unions, right? Mm-hmm. And how Black folks were primarily people who were organizing there. Yes. This has been a long time. Or Matewan in Appalachia, right? I mean, we have these examples that we can look to. What I'm trying to say is that disconnecting the class and the racial issue, especially in this country, right, is really where we go wrong. And we keep getting seduced into disconnecting both of them, but we go really wrong. And I'm going to bring it back to Medicare and mental health issues. I see this as a practicing clinician, how this falls on fault lines, who gets overdiagnosed, who doesn't have access, who is left to die at a higher rate, falls along racial lines in this country, particularly Indigenous and Black.
Yes, absolutely. And we can't move forward from day one, March 13th, to the next era until we figure out what kind of organizations do we need? What can be built that's sustainable? How can we get the funds necessary to do things, to reach out to more people? I'll give you an example. When I was in the labor movement, and you have to ask yourself, why would the labor movement eliminate a program like this? It was called Labor Neighbor, where the labor councils would literally go to neighborhoods and knock on doors, and they would knock on doors and say, are you for health care for all? Are you for this? And those were taxing issues that were gut level issues for people. And when they got those people, they would form an organization in their neighborhood, which is the foundation of kind of like what we're trying to do. Why? But the movement was shut down. It was shut down because it ran counter to the interests of some of the Democratic politicians and said, God, you're creating a power structure here that's kind of, it's gonna piss people off. And that's what we have to realize that we have to maybe do. How do we do that? People have to get involved in their unions. They have to change the leadership of their unions, because without that, without a new direction in the labor movement, we're not going to really go further. We're going to be stunted. We're going to, thanks.
And on that, I kind of want to switch it a little bit. And Edwin, I want to bring you in. One of my co-hosts, Logan, he talks a lot about how unions are good, but they still have a very big component of capitalism within them. So I kind of want to open that discussion. Edwin, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I do think that, especially here in New York, a lot of the unions and the membership are really what drives so much of the productivity. But you have leadership that can actually squash some of these movements that the members are starting, because the leadership tends to be in the hands of these of the Democratic Party or Republican Party power players. And so it's important to actually have some sort of leadership that comes from unelected members of the unions. And I think that goes back to my previous point of how can we use something like a decentralized autonomous organization to empower those who are working paycheck to paycheck, because using some sort of technology like that, you are keeping full transparency of the way that money is flowing through an organization and how that relates to how people have equal amount of input into the direction of that organization. This is something that hasn't necessarily been done yet. It's something that I would like to work on and encourage others to try to explore, because we have a limited window between now and when central bank digital currency becomes the dominant monetary system in our near future. And before they begin to smear Bitcoin as some sort of right-wing thing or something that is always used for nefarious purposes, they're going to try to convince the masses why we need to rely on the Federal Reserve and their digital currencies in order to go about our daily lives. The problem with that is that all of our transactions will be tracked. And if they see that an ordinary person is spending too much money on, say, sound equipment for a rally that they want to do in front of City Hall, they can actually punish you. And so the more that we take our money outside of the current system, then we can actually have our own operations under the hood, not through any illegal activity, perfectly legal, but just not within the grasp of the powers that be to squash our movements. And so I think it's very important that now more than ever, we try to take utility out of blockchain technology for ordinary people and use that to empower labor movements and political parties, etc.
Ed, we'll go around this way.
All right. Okay. I would say that you kind of got the cart before the horse. Before we worry about the blockchain and all that, which I totally agree. And again, I go back to historical examples that people were spied on by the man. Let's quote the man, the industry, the CIA, anybody, the company spies. Workers were spied on. They were tracked. They were whatever through history. And I think we all unfortunately know that. A counter-intel program is just the last example of it. So what we need, though, is before we kind of worry about what they're going to do with that. We have to get ourselves organized as a political force, and to stop what you're talking about, to prevent the effect of what we're doing. And it's almost as if now they probably, at this point, they're probably thinking, well, what is it that these workers are going to do? And I think what I'm saying is, like, just because I've been in the union, and the unions are important, that we need to get people inside those labor unions that are not getting a fair deal, want their union to be more aggressive, want their union to be more representative of the industry and their interests, and they feel like they're being pushed aside. Once we do that, I think then we can figure out how to deal with the resources that are going to be necessary. Because yes, they will come down, because many times people would say, well, Ed, if you had a general strike, all they'll do is they'll take your bank account and you'll be done. And I think the answer is yes, they will do that. And we have to figure out to be one step ahead of that. But we're not ready. We don't have enough organizational critical mass of people. And that's really what we're facing now, is how do we get this critical mass of people, keep those other things definitely in our toolbox, so to speak. But right now, let's get these people together, because if they don't come together with us, they're going to go to the right wingers. They're going to go somewhere else. And I think this idea that we can sit around and think that people aren't going to drift to the right, or they're going to be apathetic, is wrong. We have to provide them with solutions, better word. And that's where we come in, I think.
Lara?
Yeah, I think, your question is, it's like, it's still capitalist, right? And I think part of it is that, the question of, are unions linked up to a larger labor movement, right? And that's why it's capitalist. So what are you actually fighting for in unions if you're not linked up to larger labor movements? And for us to be careful about when we speak about unions, for example, people are often like, well, how can you be against cops? They have unions. And like 80% of cop unions are independent. They're not linked up to any sort of larger labor organization or movement. And that's part of also what we need to be refocusing. So when we are talking about unions, and particularly if we're talking about unions to advocate or fight for Medicare for all, these questions have to be talked about. How do we link them up with actual coherent labor movements that cut across unions and have a coherent idea and political analysis about why labor, for example, and healthcare need to be linked up in a particular way, and why part of our struggle needs to be an anti-capitalist struggle. It needs to be, right? And for us to think about this question of Medicare for all is an entry point for redistribution of wealth, right? And if we can sort of organize it that way, but many of the unions, the way that they're working today, are not taking up these questions. They're not pushing up against capitalism in any particular way. They're not talking about a sort of a larger movement of working class folks. They're talking about class mobility, right? At the expense of what? They're not talking about restructuring the way that capital flows in this country in any particular way.
Well, I think, excuse me, if you look at all, again, if you look at all of the unfortunate industries that have collapsed in this country, whether it was the rubber industry, the steel industry, the auto industry, it has a third of the workers or whatever, the airlines, half of them, they were all unionized. Every one of them was totally unionized up and down the ladder. So going to your point, Lara, that's the question. We need a labor movement that has some political ideology, that understands what the forces are that are for and against them. And it's like, in my experience in Western Pennsylvania, the steel mill shut down and the union was basically just like sleeping. It was like sleepwalking. And why was that? That was simply because they didn't have the right direction. They didn't have any political direction. It was tied to the Democrats. So we don't want to keep our Medicare for all movement in that box. So we should learn from that and say, well, we can't just think that passing the ACA is a road to single payer. It's bullshit. It's a road to hell. It's a road to nowhere. And so, yeah. So anyway.
Lara, I want to actually switch gears a little bit. I want to ask you, as an actual doctor and healthcare provider, what it's like when you have to deal with patients who do not have the means to get services, medication, therapy, anything like that. What is it like on your end to have to, to deal with that and try and comfort them?
Yeah, I deal with that a lot, and as a clinical psychologist, there's an added level to that because mental health parity is never a conversation when it comes to this, and we're talking, right? It's very rarely talked about in these ways. A couple things, and I think this has to be part of the struggle. If we're talking about Medicare for all, sometimes we also get sort of bogged down by this idea that it needs to be, when we're talking about Medicare, it needs to be on the side of what insurance company. In the end, Medicare is an insurance company, right? And I think that's the question for me, is that anytime I am dealing with an insurance company, I know the people I care for are on the losing side, because I'm already on the back foot having to argue. And I worked for Medicaid for many years as a policy analyst and a policy writer. There are almost virtually no clinicians on the other side making these policies. So when we look at it and we're like, this makes no sense, you're all right. It makes no sense because there's no clinical people oftentimes making these decisions, and they're certainly not holding in mind who needs these services. So number one is sort of an education process about how do we really do a workaround. And quite frankly, I'm working with a large group of people nationally and internationally around mental health co-ops, for example, that allow us to divest from insurance companies that make the decisions for us. Because insurance companies, not only do they then set up the contract and allow you to have allow access to people's health information that I would never give to anybody else. The second I make a contract with an insurance company, they can ask me for my notes, they can ask me for diagnoses, they can ask me for notes to say if I'm allowed to see somebody for another session. They dictate the length of treatment, they dictate everything. So part of what I do is to sort of work with people in coalitions to say, what are ways that we can divest from insurance companies? And that needs to be a conversation when we're talking about Medicare for all. How do we do this in a way that puts people who are receiving care, whether it's patients or clients, however they identify, and their clinicians or healthcare providers as the decision-making people, not insurance companies, not Medicare, right? Because if we just sort of say Medicare for all and don't take up these questions, then it's just going to be Medicare making the decisions about how long a treatment can be, right? My working model is that folks come to me and name their price so that I don't have to use an insurance model. And it's a community process. Talk about redistribution of wealth. That's how I talk about it. If you have money, you pay more and you underwrite the person that I see or many folks that I might see for zero. And it's a range of seeing people. And we see a lot of people across this country, particularly, doing this more and more so that we can divest entirely from insurance companies. That needs to be part of the conversation when we're talking about Medicare for all. Who's the decision-making party in this? And that needs to be a collaborative communal process between people getting care and their doctors and their caregivers, not Medicare and not an insurance company.
Absolutely. And that's why we're pretty adamant about saying national improved Medicare for all, because we don't want everyone to have Medicare. We want Medicare expanded into no fees, no copays, no deductibles, no premiums. We want more like an NHS, and it's kind of it could be a misnomer. It does kind of lead people to think, well, Medicare has got a lot of issues. I don't know if I want that for everyone. So you're absolutely right. Oh, hi. Hello. Thank you so much for joining, Eric. This is Eric Kestner. Ed, can you silence that? Is that your phone?
Yeah, that was me. Yeah.
Eric is joining us from DC. He actually went to DC to go to the White House, and he's been out there basically fighting for Medicare for all, standing on the side of the road at the White House with signs and trying to get, people involved. So how's it going, Eric?
It's going great. Thanks for having me on, Joy.
Absolutely.
Yeah, my name's Eric Kestner. I'm from the Seattle area. I drove out here, and my son and I actually came out here. He flew back, but yeah, we're working on a couple things. So I'm with Real Progressives, and I work in the outreach and activism department, and I'm the creator of Yellow Vest Actions back in October of 2019. We're formerly called Burning Your Vest, but then after Super Tuesday, we changed the name of the group, and then finally met up with Real Progressives, and now the name of the group is Yellow Vest Actions for Real Progressives. So you can go check that out and join us if you'd like. Also, go to if you're new to MMT, go to realprogressives.org and click the media button on the drop-down menu, and there's a lot of great articles on MMT. But anyway, yeah, I'm here, and we've got a twofold mission, and that is to have direct actions for Medicare for All, to organize with the March for Medicare for All for a DC march, hopefully, and also to get people to start talking about MMT. It's kind of hush hush around here. There's only one person that is one congressperson that's come forward to, officially on the record talk about MMT, and that's John Yarmuth, a Democrat out of Kentucky, who sits opposite Mitch McConnell. And he did something amazing. He leapfrogged all of the squad as far as being a progressive, and he officially went on the record, talked about modern monetary theory, said the words, held up Stephanie Kelton's book, plugged it, and proceeded to tell us that Americans and a lot of members of Congress need a re-education on the way our economic system works, and that that everyone is asking the wrong questions, being how are you going to pay for it? That's the wrong question. But they teach us to ask the wrong questions. We've been propagandized from birth till death, right? And they tell us that where are you going to find the money? We're going to have to borrow it from China. This burden's going to be on our grandchildren, as we run this debt up, and it's all just lies. And that's not the set of questions we should be asking. We should be asking, what do the American people need, is what John Yarmuth said, because we have the ability to do what the American people need. We can pay for whatever there's the political will for. So, oh yeah, this is me on the side of the road, and we've got a lot of support in DC here. There's people honking their butts off for Medicare for All. I'm over on the George Washington Bridge there. Can you see that clip?
Well, I can't, but
Well, I think
totally
Andy put the clip up for everybody there.
I totally agree with your sentiments on MMT, and if you guys want to learn more, you can watch the panel prior. But I do want to keep it about activism, since we don't have much time left. But what are you finding? I know you said a lot of people are honking their horns, but are you hearing any stories? Are people telling you what would improve with their life if they had actual health care, or speaking to any homeless people, or anyone with some kind of impactful story?
Yeah, well, at one point, this conservative movement, the People's Convoy, was approaching town, and I was getting so many honks on the George Washington Bridge from passersby. I mean, that's not a lefty movement over there on the George Washington Bridge. That's an everybody movement, right? They're all just a bunch of random people driving by, and a majority of people would honk. And I started thinking that this is not just a progressive movement. This is a people movement. It left, right, communist, socialist, everybody needs healthcare. There's a lot of crossover here, and I think that this is the issue that Americans can all get behind, that we can unite on. And so I got curious, and I started wondering, what about this convoy? What do these guys think about Medicare for all and uniting the working class? And so I brought my signs over to an overpass there, and we set them up. And one sign said Medicare for all now, and the other one, giant signs, right? The other one says unite the working class, and everybody was honking for it. And you know, it's not a left or right issue. It's a everybody issue. And I have the strong feeling just the people in Washington, D.C. alone is enough to start a coup around here for Medicare for all. There's a ton of people here. There's a lot of activists. There's a lot of supporters. But anyway, to get to your question, we were winding down that day, and a guy was walking by. I had the signs leaning up against the side of my car, and the first one, you know, the only one that he could see, because they were stacked on top of each other, the only sign that he could see was, you know, to unite the working class. And he's like, yeah, let's do that. And I was like, yeah, let's get some health care too, man. And he's like, oh, geez, I could retire. I mean, this guy was retirement age, right? And it's like, I could retire if I had health care. You know, so what we're hearing is that the lack of health care keeps people working shitty jobs. You know, they need the money and they can't retire, and the only reason that they're working, a lot of them, is just for healthcare. You know, we've got a lot of families where one person in the family is just keeping a job just for healthcare. So, and there's a lot of better things that people could be doing besides working for the man, right? So I really think that a lot of people are ready for this. I think it's on the tip of everybody's tongue. I don't think we're in a bubble on this issue. I mean, there's some issues, you know, like MMT. Sometimes we think, oh wow, we might be in a little bubble here, just with the people on social media that were around. But on Medicare for all, we are not in a bubble. Everybody wants it. Not everybody, but a majority of people want it. I think it's 70-75% in America, and I believe there's 120 co-sponsors on HR 676, and you know, people aren't going to stop talking about it until we get it. And so I really think that the time is now. And what really brought me out here now is I see our window shrinking for this. I see Biden trying to get on this REACH program that Trump started, and trying to privatize Medicare for all. That's terrifying. I see you know, this pandemic winding down, and in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, God, if we can't get Medicare for all during a frickin' pandemic, you know, we might not get it at all. So I think now is really the time that we need to force this issue. And I think there's enough people in the Virginia, District of Columbia, Washington, D.C. area to have a lot of people for a march if we organize one. So lots of crossover. Everybody that I talk to about Medicare for all, you know, sometimes when I'm protesting, I'll say the same thing over and over to people. I'll say, hey, you deserve health care. And people always come back at me with the same response, and that is, we all do, you know. And we're not in a bubble. You know, America is ready for this. We just need everybody in the same place at the same time to push it through and pressure these guys. I don't feel that politicians feel online pressure. You know, I think that the only time they really feel pressure is when you're outside their window with your sign and you're screaming at them, and they're trying to figure out how to get home. I mean, that's when we have the opportunity to move them left. And I don't think it's going to happen unless people get in the streets and make it happen. You know, history has shown us over and over. This is a Bernie thing that I heard him say in 2015 at the Seattle rally. He said that every successful movement that's ever gained any traction, whether it's civil rights or women's rights or gay rights, any of those successful movements, none of them would have happened unless those movements were catalyzed in the streets. Masses of people coming out in the streets. People getting jailed. People, sometimes dying. To say that in this country things need to be fair, right? And so, as far as women's rights go, I mean, there was hunger strikes, and women died, and it was out on the streets where civil rights movement gained all the traction, and that's when politicians feel pressure. They don't feel pressure anything we do online, I don't think. So I think the only way that we're going to get what we want is in the streets. Not that I disagree with voting. I think voting is where our responsibility starts, not where it ends. But I don't think that our representatives, no matter who we vote for, no matter how we vote, I don't think that they're going to be able to push Medicare for all across the finish line, because they're bought, right? So the only way to do it is mass direct actions. And so that's why I'm here.
And to touch on that, and I digress because it's not about healthcare, but I recently had an activist, a gentleman from Oahu, Hawaii, and he was talking about Red Hill contamination, which is, very much racist against indigenous peoples, and, was contaminating people's water. They have 20 bunkers full of oil, and each one was about 25-story building in size, and their water line was 100 feet below it. So obviously it was leaking, people were getting sick, everything like that. Had this gentleman on, and 3 days later of last week, Red Hill was shut down after 80 years. Water protectors were there every day with signs chanting. It was shut down after 80 years. And that just happened a few days ago. It's incredible. So when people get defeatist, I get it. I have my days. I have my weeks sometimes. But it is possible. And also, if you haven't seen my Stephen Donziger interview, I asked him, and this man has been through hell and back and will probably keep going through hell. And I asked him, are the people in power greater than the power of the people? And I want people to watch what his answer was. It's pinned on my Twitter post. And if he can say the answer he gave, we can say it too. But in any case, I want to, I guess the last question will be, when we talk about what we want to do, and when we get pushback like, what's the point? It's not going to work. Have you ever been given an actual suggestion of what maybe they do think would work? And also, what, as far as today forward, what do we need to do to actually make national improved Medicare for all a reality? So I guess we'll go around again. Edwin?
So I think the most immediate step is fighting against the DCEs, the direct contracting entities, because that seems to be one of the most prominent obstacles in the short term. In the long term, and this is a little bit of a response to what Eric just said about tragedy, and if we're not going to get universal healthcare in a pandemic, when are we ever going to get it? Well, actually, I think that there is undoubtedly a Great Recession Part 2 that is incoming within the next year or so. And I think it's very important that we all prepare for it, because the oligarchs are preparing for it. And so we should be preparing for it as well. The main difference between the pandemic and the incoming recession is that during the pandemic, as long as you complied with the FDA, Pfizer axis of evil, you were able to maintain your employment and keep your employer-based healthcare. and only a minority of people who refused to comply lost their jobs and subsequently their health insurance plans, their private plans. But during a recession where there's going to be massive layoffs and higher unemployment, then you will start to see it actually crack down into what used to be middle-class voters who are no longer in the middle class and will start to actually join these actions and want to revolt and want to vote third party at the ballot box. And so this is something that we as a movement should be prepared for and take advantage of that tragedy to push for something like single payer Medicare for all, because we're going to see a lot of people who didn't lose their health insurance during this pandemic losing it as a result of economic turmoil.
So, I want to remind everyone, I've been saying it like all 16 hours I've been on the air this week, but Biden has the ability to give us an executive order, 1881A, literally could sign an executive order today, give us all national improved Medicare for all of us. No money, no payment. You're uninsured, you get it. You're underinsured, you get it. You're an immigrant, you get it. Literally has that ability to do it today. We are watching eugenics of the poor start holding these people accountable. Please go to our website and look into our grievance that we are literally filing with the United Nations because of what they are doing and how they are ignoring that bill. So absolutely. Ed?
I think, first of all, I want to thank you for, having this opportunity to get on here and engage in this. Hopefully we can do it again. And I agree that online is good as an organizing tool, but we can't, we're not going to win this by this method. But what do we need to do? I would say we need to figure out how we can get ourselves organized in either local groups that are for national single payer Medicare for all. In other words, like why aren't there hundreds of local organizing committees for national Medicare for all around the country? Because we can't mobilize the mass of people that everybody says is for us unless we ourselves have a vehicle that they can get into. We have to be nonpartisan. We have to do direct action. We have to do smart electoral politics, and we have to basically persevere. We have to raise some money. We have to, because we can't do these things unless we have some resources. The task is immense. The ruling class has, unbelievable, obviously. They're going to be able to swipe down on us whenever we get stronger. Usually they don't attack us until they know we're getting stronger. And I think we already have shown that we have the capability of doing that, but we got to get ourselves organized. And local groups got to get organized so that we can then coalesce, whether it's in DC or whether in our capitals or our congressional districts. But that's really, to me, without being organized, we're just yapping around at ourselves and bitching and moaning, but we're not really going to be a political force. So if anything comes today, look at national single payer, think about getting yourselves organized, because that's really what we're trying to do in coalition with other groups.
And always, always, always have a list of demands.
Yes.
If you do an action without demands, it's a parade. Don't bother. Have demands. And demand. Don't ask. Demand. Lara?
Yeah. And then demand, don't take the playbook of like starting reasonable and making things digestible to people. That's not what works. People move to the right. So ask for everything. I laughed, Joy, because when you said that Red Hill is like a change in direction, I actually don't think it is. I think that's one of the things we need to do is stop thinking about this as a single issue. Our fight is alongside water protectors and land protectors, and all these issues are linked up in a way that when we can talk about people living in dignity and outside of oppressive structures, we're also talking about all those things. We're talking about climate catastrophe. We're talking about, people's right to dignity in terms of living their life aligned with how they want it to be. Those are all linked up. So that's one thing I would say is we need to stop making this just an issue about this. This is linked up across issues where we're fighting oppressive structures. The other thing I'll say is stop getting seduced into the conversation around how we fund this, right? I heard you say that before, and I love that you asked that question, sort of like tongue in cheek, because it is not our responsibility to decide where this funding comes from. We see that this government, particularly this settler colony, funds Israel to the tune of $3 billion every single year. There is funding that comes to us. So our getting bogged down in these fights around how are we going to find funding for is a deflective technique. This is the clinician speaking now. People use deflection to bog us down in these details and to disorganize us and discombobulate us from the central issue that we're working about. Don't succumb to those questions, because those questions are not ours to figure out. When people can figure out where funding comes from for everything else that they want under some particularly military and imperial wars, then we can demand that they find the way for everybody, not just people with jobs, to have adequate health care.
Edwin? Or no, wait. Yeah, you already went. Sorry.
Aaron.
No worries.
Yeah, I think that I think we need to stoke outrage, and the best way to do that is get people learning MMT. Sorry to go back to that, but the money's there for whatever we need, whatever there's political will to accomplish. The money's there for it. As we see with this war budget, it seems that we have the political will to have a $750 billion war budget every year. So the money's there for whatever we need. But when you find out, when you learn MMT and you find out that the government isn't constrained like we thought it was, when people are asking themselves the question, how are you going to pay for it? And that's the wrong question. And the real question is, why are they trying to starve us out? Why are they trying to, not by the way they talk, but by the way they're voting? It seemingly that they're trying to starve us out. I'm sorry, but that's just the way it seems. And, Steve Grumbine has that austerity is murder tagline, and it's so true. So once people realize that the money is right there and it's been there all along, and that all of these deficit hawks are lying to us, that really makes it come full circle for a lot of folks, and they realize that the things that we want are within reach. And also, just to bounce off what Lara was saying, we do need to go for a whole bunch all at once. Bottle Kaboom, he says the three-layer cake, right? That is that the Green New Deal, which is what we want, that equals economic justice and environmental justice. That is what the Green New Deal equals. And so with the Green New Deal, that's a huge build out, right? Lots and lots of jobs. So we need a federal job guarantee with an attached healthcare benefits package, and establish a new base wage, whatever it is, $15 an hour, $20 an hour, whatever that base wage is, would be the new minimum wage. And we can kill a lot of birds with one bundle, So, attach a federal jobs guarantee to the Green New Deal, to that build out, and give everybody that signs up health care. And I think that's the best direction to go.
I was going to kind of end on this note, and Lara said it perfectly. I think, we have to realize everything is inextricably linked to healthcare. Everything. Like this weekend, for the past 3 days, you have seen panels on environment and healthcare, mental health and healthcare, disability and healthcare, economics and healthcare. You have literally seen panels, 11 different panels on different topics, all related to healthcare. This is the major issue. Yes, student debt is important. Yes, Green New Deal is important. Without healthcare, we have nothing. We need to be taken care of health-wise, not insurance-wise, health-wise. Everyone, meaning homeless, meaning low income, meaning people of color, meaning disabled, meaning everyone, national, and then everything else can fall into place, but that has to come first. MLK Jr. said it is the greatest form of violence. We are witnessing violence right now. So I've been on the air like 16 hours this weekend. I am so honored. I am so, this weekend was phenomenal. I cannot thank the four of you enough. All of our panelists, stay tuned. We still have more. But wait, there's more. So thank the four of you so much for all you're doing, all you contributed, and I am so glad and honored to be in this fight with all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Troy.
Thank you. Much love.